What's up, AN Camp? This is Justin Gibney, president of the AN campaign, and this is another civic update where we are trying to raise civic literacy among Christians so that as you go out and engage society, you can do so in a more informed, effective, and faithful manner. We want to make sure that Christians are glorifying God in how we engage politically. And in order to do that, we have to know how to apply our values to the most pressing issues of the day. We need to be well versed in how the system actually works. And we need to understand the spirit of the day. What is it that we're going up against, and what are the things that we need to fix? And if we're not able to do that, it makes it harder for us to protect human dignity, to promote human flourishing, which are just ways of saying to love our neighbor, to actively love our neighbor, because we know that politics gives us the opportunity to advocate for our neighbors, to really actively look after their well-being. And it's an opportunity that we should not take lightly and that we should use, again, to glorify God. One of the things that I've been saying lately in these updates is that it's not just about answering the political questions as they are given to us. Sometimes we have to understand that if an issue is not framed properly, then we can end up with two wrong answers. So if we allow progressives to frame the issues for us, if we allow conservatives to frame the issue for us, we get frustrated because we look at it and we say, why are both of these answers, why do they both look so terrible? I don't like either option. And a lot of times when it comes to the issues, we get answered, we get, the issues come at us in a way where it seems like there's two wrong answers because they are framed improperly. And so Christians have to frame the issues and frame the questions for ourselves to make sure that we're actually getting at the truth and not just answering something that was created by a hidden agenda or something else. We have to take the time to do that for ourselves. The AND campaign is here to help you accomplish that. And so that's why we do these civic updates. Today, I want to talk a little bit about politicians and political parties hiding their faults and their mistakes, and also the questions that they can't answer behind the other party, right? When politicians get tough questions, or they get a really tough critique, or they don't have the answers that they need, that they should have because they haven't been thorough enough, one of the techniques that they use is to hide behind the other party, right? So instead of answering the critique, I point at the other party and I scream at the other party, cause this confusion and chaos, get my base excited about going against the other party, instead of answering the question or the critique that was in front of me. And we see this happen all the time. And the only way that this rhetorical device even works is if we as the people allow it to work, if we allow them not to answer the questions. And so let me provide you with a couple examples, recent examples of politicians hiding their mistakes, their faults, and their lack of thoroughness behind the other party, because they know that we're so partisan these days that as long as they blame something on the other party, they won't even have to answer the question. So we saw with the president, this back and forth between the president and Congressman Elijah Cummings, where Cummings was critiquing the president, other people were critiquing the president on what was going on the border, on what's going on with guns, and just a lot of issues that are going on in this country. And I think those were fair critiques. But what as staying true to form and doing what unfortunately usually happens in this day and time, instead of the president answering the critique that was in front of him, what does the president do? He deflects, right? So this is all about kind of deflection. So instead of saying, okay, you said this and this was your assertion, I'm going to answer that assertion, he says, look at Baltimore, look at Chicago, look at the terrible job that Democrats are doing there. These congressmen and even their mayors, look at the terrible way that they're treated. And he said some things that I'm not going to repeat. I think talked about those cities in a way that's unbecoming of a president, and that was really just unfortunate. But the main point is, you didn't address the issue. Right? You didn't address the critique that was in front of you that needs to be addressed. And what happens is his party allows him to use that as a cop-out. So instead of addressing the critique, I cop out and say, well, look at them, look at what they're doing. A few weeks ago, I talked about whataboutism, where somebody's given a critique or they're asked a question and they just say, well, what about the Democrats? They do this and they do that. Or what about the Republicans? They do this and do that. Again, it's a rhetorical device, a rhetorical technique to avoid answering questions, right? And this is what we saw with Elijah Cummings and Trump. Now, the other problem with that conversation is not only that did Trump point out what was going on in Baltimore, not to help the folks in Baltimore, not because he had shown that he cared about Baltimore at any other time, but just to win the argument, right? He was just trying to win the argument by pointing out to these people who may be living in terrible conditions. But here's the other side of the conversation. He's using it, and some other conservatives are using these folks who are going through these issues to win the argument. But it also allows the people on the left, the people who do have some control over these terrible environments, it allows them to avoid the issue by saying, hey, that's just the Republicans talking. They're just insulting us. Now they don't have to answer the question, right? So one side's trying to win the argument. The other side gets to say, well, they're being unfair. They're being mean. And now they're not addressing the issue either. And who suffers? The people that suffer are the people who are living in that environment, because now both sides have found a way not to address the issue. And that is an issue that needs to be addressed. If there are children, if there are any people living in rat-infested environments, which there is evidence that there is a serious infestation that needs to be dealt with, that means babies could be getting bit by rats, that there's all kinds of diseases and issues that goes along with that. That's an issue that needs to be addressed. That's an issue that shouldn't be deflected, or that's not an issue that I should be able to say, well, the Republicans are just mean. We don't need to pay attention to this issue because he talked about it wrong. No, it needs to be addressed. Here's another example, and this example of kind of hiding behind the other party when you have a mistake or when you haven't been thorough, happened in the Democratic debates last week. In the Democratic debates, there were some questions that came up about how are you going to pay for Medicare, and just how do you plan to make sure this policy is realistic? Show us the numbers, talk to us about the numbers. And instead of answering that question, there were a couple different candidates who the rhetorical device that they used instead of answering the questions was to say, well, that's just a Republican talking point, or to say that's just a scare tactic. Now they don't have to answer the question. They don't have to give the numbers. They don't have to say, well, if the majority of Americans are against this, or if the majority of Americans don't want to lose their private insurance, what are you going to do about that? Oh, that's just a Republican talking point. What? That's a cop-out. You haven't answered the question. And again, we see these rhetorical devices. And I want to give a shout out to CNN, because the commentators on CNN really called that out. And so hopefully that rhetorical device won't be used again. The commentators say, look, when somebody asks you a question about your policy and they ask you to explain the numbers or ask you to explain a problem with the policy, you can't just point and scream at the other party and say that's a Republican talking point. Maybe it is a Republican or a Democrat talking point, but that doesn't mean it's illegitimate. Maybe it's a good question that you need to answer. They only get away with these things, people, and Christians, listen to me. They only get away with deflecting and copping out when we're so partisan that we're okay with them not answering the question as long as they make the other side look bad. Are you so partisan that you're willing to let people suffer because you're not going to make your people answer the question that they need to answer? That's something that we have to deal with. Are we that partisan? Is that the position that we're going to take? I talked about this even further about the Baltimore conversation and some of the narratives that go into the gun conversation. I talked about this quite a bit on this week's episode of Church Politics. Make sure that you check that out when you get a chance. It's me and Michael Ware. Michael Ware did faith outreach for the Obama campaign and then went into the White House to do faith outreach as well. We do a podcast every week where we talk about political issues from a biblical worldview. So if you like this, check that out, because we go into it even deeper on there. But thanks for being with me this week. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Remember, hold these folks accountable. Make them answer the questions, because when you let them hide behind the other party, it only makes people suffer even further. Take care.